How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're sending Daf Pei Beis, Daf 82 of Masechta Zevachim. Friends, okay, here's the dealio with Daf 82. First of all, I assume that you can't hear the balagan that's going on in the background, but just in case you do, my apologies. It's Thursday night over here at Nachlaot. For the past 5 weeks or so, this group of group of troublemakers has been coming on Thursday night and making a big balagan. So my apologies if you hear that. We're gonna today, just before we even get into kind of the content of today's daf, just in terms of big adol, what I want to accomplish. So we're gonna start at the Mishnah towards the bottom of daf Pei Aleph Amud Beis, and there's a lot I want to get done today, because my plan is to actually finish the parak, which finishes on Pei Gimel Amud Aleph, kind of about 2/3, 75% of the way through Pei Gimel Amud Aleph. But that's because it's Thursday night, and then whatever. I just kind of want to start with the new parak tomorrow. So I think that's my plan. So it might be a bit of a big daf, but I think that's my plan. If you want, you can always, I guess, technically turn off the daf at the top of Pei Gimel and pick it up tomorrow. But anyways, okay. So what does this daf actually talk about? We're going to learn two Mishnayos, and as I said, we're going to finish the parak. The first topic we're going to discuss is be'etzem, when blood gets into the heichal, more specifically when blood from an inner chatas gets mixed together with blood from an outer chatas, and what do you do about it? But that kind of gets us into the topic of when blood from a korban that's not supposed to be in the heichal gets into the heichal, is the korban pasul or not? We're going to see machlokas about that, and that's going to be kind of the first Mishnah that we learn today. And then when we get to the second Mishnah, it discusses when some blood exits the azarah. So what happens if you have a korban chatas, let's say, and the blood was received in two vessels, and one of the vessels either went outside of the azarah or into the heichal. So what happens in that scenario? How do we treat that? And then it gets into all sorts of kavachomers and things. And the final topic that we will get to already on Daf Pei Gimel is at which point blood becomes pasul in the heichal, right? So if we assume that blood that gets into the heichal makes the korban pasul, at which point, just getting into the heichal, or only if you do zrikas, apply matno sadam. So, that is what is on the agenda today. All sorts of kind of bloody things. And with that, we will finish, hopefully, the 8th parak of Masechta Zevachim. It's maybe that kind of wraps up all of our blood mixture discussions, but I guess we will have to see. So, friends, without further ado, let us jump in to Daf Pei Beis of Masechta Zevachim. All right, friends, we're going to begin on Daf Pei Aleph Amud Beis, on the first of the wide lines, 2, 4, 6 lines from the bottom of the Amud. Says the Mishnah, new Mishnah, Hanitanin bifnim shenisarvu benitanin b'chutz. Okay, of course, we've been discussing different bloods that get mixed together. We were discussing, for example, blood of a chatas that get mixed together with blood of an ola. So now, what happens if blood of a korban that's in the heichal, right, a Palim Davar Shel Tzibur, Par Kohen Mashiach, right, Chatas Apnimi. So if the blood of a Chatas Apnimi gets mixed together with the blood of, whether it's a Chatas Achitzon or some other korban that is in the azarah but not in the heichal, Yishafchu La'ama. So what do you do if we have Anitanim Bifnim Shenisayva Benitanim B'chutz? So the Mishnah says you push it, spill it out into the Amma and drain it out of the azarah. Wow, something very loud just took place outside. Now, notably, Rabbi Eliezer does not argue here. Right, in the previous Mishnah, we had, if you have the blood of a korban chatas that gets mixed together with the blood of a korban ola, the chacham says spill out in the Amma. Rabbi Eliezer says no, you apply it to the top of the mizbech. Here, Rabbi Eliezer doesn't say anything notably. Nosan bachutz v'chazav nosan b'fnim. Now, if, however, the kohen did not heed the advice to spill it out into the amma, and rather he applied the blood in the azarah and then in the heichal, right? Because you have korbanos from the azarah, they got mixed together with korbanos from that go in the heichal. So if the kohen first applied the blood in the azarah and then in the heichal, kosher. Okay, beseder. He wasn't supposed to do it, but it's kosher. Bifnim v'chazav v'nosam b'chutz. However, if it was the other way around, if he first took the blood into the heichal, and applied the blood in the heichal, and then went back out to the azarah, well, in that case, Rabbi Akiva pasul. Rabbi Akiva says it's pasul because, according to Rabbi Akiva, as we're going to see in a second, the blood of any korban that is brought into the heichal becomes pasul. Wow, mamish, those troublemakers outside are making so much noise that, wow, it's unbelievable the level of chutzpah. I mean, wow, to just come into like a neighborhood and just to make that level of noise, music and balagan and drinking and fighting, and it's unbelievable. Wow. It's just like the level of like audacity is pretty impressive. Like mamish. Yeah, the neighbors come out, they fight with the net, and like these kids just, it's more important for them to like make a balagan than, it's just unbelievable. All the neighbors go crazy. Anyways, it doesn't matter, they just come back week after week. Wow. Sorry. Anyways, so Rabbi Akiva's opinion is that any korbanis that their blood is brought into the heichal, the korban automatically becomes pasul, and therefore, says Rabbi Akiva, that if this blood that got combined, the blood of the chato of the nitanim b'fnim shnisavim nitanim b'chutz, if they get combined, so then if they're brought into the heichal, so now the korban is pasul. So there's no point of bringing it back out to the azarah. The korban's already pasul. So Rabbi Akiva pasul. So Rabbi Akiva says that the blood, is pasul once it goes. The blood, at least from the outside korbanos, are pasul once the blood goes into the azarah, into the heichal. The chacham machshir, but the chacham say it's kosher so long as it's not a chatas. So long as it's not a chatas, because there's a pasuk, friends. Because there's a pasuk. I'll read to you the pasuk. The pasuk says v'chol chatas, and this is going to be the big discussion of today. Essentially, is how to learn this out. But the pasuk says v'chol chatas, any korban chatas, seemingly, asher yuva midama ela oil moed l'chaver b'kodesh, any blood of a korban chatas, kilo chatas achitzon, that its blood is brought into the oil moed, into the heichal. Now, chatas achitzon doesn't go. Chatas apnimi goes into the eichel. Chatas achitzon stays out in the azarah. So, lo sochal beish tisarif, lo seochel beish tisarif. You have to burn it. So, the chacham say that only applies to korban chatas, right? So, therefore, when it says in the Mishnah, v'chacham machshirim, the chacham said that it's okay. The korban is kosher. That's because, as long as it's not, if it's a chatas, so they agree that if the blood of a chatas achitzon goes into the eichel, the chatas achitzon is now pasul. But so long as it's not a chatas, let's say it's the blood of a ola that gets mixed together with the blood of a parlam davar shel tzibur. So if the blood first went into the eichel and then went back out to the azarah to do zrikas adam there, so it would be kosher according to the chum. But Rabbi Akiva would say pasul because he learns that all korbanos that have been brought into the eichel become, if the blood is brought into the eichel, then the korban becomes pasul. Because Rabbi Akiva would say, kol damim shenichnasu lechaper be'eichel, that any blood that was brought into the eichel, psulin, makes the korban pasul. I don't care if it's a korban chatas, a korban shlomim, a korban olah, it makes no difference. They're all going to be pasul if the blood is brought into the eichel. V'chacham is the chacham say chatas bavad, only a korban chatas that its blood is brought into the eichel will make the chatas pasul, but if the same thing happened with the korban olah, for example, the korban will remain kosher. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, and says Rabbi Eliezer, Afa Ashim Shenemar Kachatas Ka'ashim, as we've seen in the past, that says Rabbi Eliezer, that they, what was that, Daf Yud, I think I saw, but we saw it much earlier in the Masechta. Of course, we're already at Daf Pei Beis in Masechta Zevachim, unbelievable. But we saw much earlier in the Masechta that Rabbi Eliezer learns Kachatas Ka'ashim, that he compares Asham and Chatas, and therefore if a korban, so Rabbi Eliezer agrees with Rabbi Akiva that Rabbi Eliezer agrees with the Chachamim, that if the blood of a Chatas is brought into the heichal, so then the Chatas will be pasul. And he says, however, it's not just the Chatas, it's also the Asham, because it's also korban Asham, because the pasuk says Kachatas Ka'asham, it compares Asham to Chatas, and if bringing the blood into the heichal makes a Chatas pasul, it also makes an Asham pasul. Okay, givaldig. I'm going to drink a little bit of water. Now, says the Gemara, V'niflog nami Rabbi Eliezer b'ha. Why doesn't Rabbi Eliezer argue here as well? Right? For example, when it came to the blood of a ola and the blood of a chatas that got mixed together, the Chacham said spill it onto the amma, and Rabbi Eliezer says no, apply it to the top of the mizbeach. Why doesn't Rabbi Eliezer over here give a suggestion for what to do instead of spilling it out into the amma? The answer is heichal li'avid. Well, because what suggestion would Rabbi Eliezer make? Nesiv bachutz v'adu nesiv lifnim. If he would say, okay, what you're going to do is first apply the blood out in the azarah, and then apply it in the heichal, right? You have the blood of an inner chatos and the blood of an outer korban that get mixed together. So maybe you'll say first apply it in the azarah and then apply it into the heichal. However, there's a problem. Kishem shemitzvah lahaktim elyonim letachtonim, kach mitzvah lahaktim ponim pnim lachutz. The thing is, there's precedence when it comes to korbanos. We're going to learn about it right now. We're wrapping up the 8th parak of Masechta Zevachim today. When we get to the 10th parak, that's parak Kol HaTadir, we're going to learn about precedence of all sorts of rules of precedence when it comes to korbanos. And it says the Gemara that one rule of precedence is that inner korbanos take precedence to outer korbanos. So you would not, right? Rabbi Eliezer cannot suggest to first apply the blood in the azarah and then in the heichal. Okay, so then what about the opposite? The nesiv lifnim v'other nesiv lachutz. So it's the opposite. Okay, why doesn't Rabbi Eliezer suggest apply the blood in the heichal and then apply the blood outside of the heichal? Chaver, like you might have guessed. Kevin deika chatas v'osham techinichnos damen psulin lo psika lei. Well, of course, we were just talking about how when the blood of korbanos is brought into the heichal, so it makes the korban pasul. Now, according to Rabbi Eliezer, that specifically if the blood of a korban chatas is brought into the heichal, or the blood of a korban asham, if it was the blood of an ola or a shlamim, it would not make the korban pasul. However, since there is the chatas and there is the asham, where Rabbi Eliezer cannot cannot suggest or rule to bring the blood first into the heichal and then back out to the azarah, because by chatas and asham it would make the korban pasul. So because that is not a suggestion that works for chatas and asham, i.e., it's not a suggestion that works in all cases, so he doesn't want to make a suggestion that can't kind of just be applied generally, and therefore Rabbi Eliezer refrains from making a suggestion. He does not argue, rather he agrees with the Tanakama, who says that if the blood of if inner blood gets mixed with outer blood, simply spill it into the amma, because he can't suggest to first apply it outside, right, in the azarah first, because azarah does not take precedence, and he cannot suggest to first apply it in the heichal, because you risk making the korban pasul if it's a chatas or an asham. Now the Mishnah had continued, so now we are going to get into the discussion about this halacha that when blood of a korban that is not supposed to be in the heichal goes into the heichal, the korban becomes pasul. We are going to discuss this. Amar Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Mashal Rabbi Akiva. You can add those words, Rabbi Akiva. Limad over dome. Okay, so these next lines are a little bit. To read these, it's not hard, but to read these next few lines, you have to like bend over backwards a little bit. So I'm just going to kind of read them as I see best fit. So Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel again says Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel Mashal. I'll add the words to Rabbi Akiva Lamad over dome. So Rabbi Akiva had said, okay, that this halacha of when the blood of a korban is brought into the heichal, and it's not supposed to be in the heichal, so the korban is pasul, is limited. No, so according to Rabbi Akiva, it applies not just to korban chatas, but to all korbanos, right? So the Mishnah, if you look at the pasuk, right? I'll read you the pasuk again. The pasuk says, "B'chol chatas asher yuva midam elo moed," etc. The pasuk seems to only be talking about a chatas, and yet Rabbi Akiva says no, it's talking about all korbanos. How come? So says Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, well, I'll tell you a parable. The Talmud shemozag l'rabo b'chamin. If you have a student who's serving wine to his rebbe, and of course back in those times wine was diluted, and he was diluting the wine with hot water. Right, shemozag l'rabo b'chamin. He was diluting the wine for his rebbe with hot water. V'amar lo, and the rebbe says to his student, Mizogli, add the word bechamin. Dilute for me with hot water. Amelo b'meh. And then the student says, with what kind of water should I dilute with? Now, yeah, it's weird because the Rebbe just said hot water, but okay. So Amar lo. Now the Rebbe says, Lo bechamin anu asukin. Well, we're already diluting with hot water. So clearly when I said hot water, I didn't mean hot water. Let's go weiter for a second. And therefore, I mean whether with hot water or with cold water. Meaning. So you have basically the student was diluting his Rebbe's wine for him, and he was using hot water to dilute the wine. Now, if the Rebbe were to simply say to his Talmud, please dilute my wine, so since the student is already diluting the wine with hot water, so by default, if the Rebbe simply says, please, can you dilute my wine for me? It would be with more hot water, because they're already using hot water, so it would just be more of the same. So by default already, the request from the Rebbe by default to dilute his next cup of wine for him would be in the same way as the first cup was diluted with hot water. Now when the Rebbe says, please dilute my wine for me with hot water, why does he have to say hot water? Even if he didn't say hot water, it would be with hot water, because that's already what they're doing. That's already what's going on. So therefore, when the Rebbe says hot water, dilute my wine for me with hot water, it means even with hot water. Meaning hot water, cold water, but you can also use hot water. That's what because if just to say hot water, you didn't have to say anything. They're already using hot water. You would just say, please, can you dilute another cup of wine for me? It would have been in the same way that it was before with the hot water. So why does he say dilute my wine for me with hot water if you didn't need to say it? Because he's saying even with hot water. Cold water, hot water, whatever you like. And therefore the same thing applies over here. Hachanami here also, by this halacha about the blood in the heichal. Mirde bechatas askin, on this pasuk, the pasuk that we just read a minute ago, that says don't bring the blood into the heichal. If you look at that pasuk in the Chumash, it's already in a parsha that's talking about, in a section of the Torah that's talking about a korban chatas. We're already talking about a korban chatas. So if the Torah there is already talking about a korban chatas, it doesn't need to say v'chol chatas asher yuva midam elomod. It could have just said v'chol asher yuva, and already, okay, right? V'chol what? Well, chatas. We're talking about chatas, right? So why does it have to say chatas if we're already talking about chatas? So it must mean even a chatas, but all korbanos. So michtei b'chatas askin, we're already talking about chatas over there. So we're already talking about chatas over there. Chatas, the cause of Achman Alamid. So then why did the pasuk say chatas if we are already talking about chatas? Even if you didn't say chatas, we would know we're talking about chatas because that's the context. So elalab chatas kaminala, ela kol kodshim. Rather, it's not just chatas, but rather all kodshim, including a korban chatas. Maskefla, Ravuna Breder of Yeshua. However, Ravuna Breder of Yeshua asks a question. Michdei. Is Rabu kol kodshim legabe, you can skip legabe mizbech, leinyan mariko ushtifa. Look, the thing is, right before, so really 2 psukim before this pasuk about the blood going into the heichal, it was talking about mariko ushtifa, that any vessel that was used to cook the korban chatas, you have to, if it's earthenware, you got to break it, otherwise you got to wash it out. And we said we already included all kachim for that, right? So meaning, right, this is the context of the parsha is korban chatas. Now, even though the context of this section, right, when I say parsha, I don't mean parsha is a shavua, I mean a parsha in the Torah, a section in the Torah. So this parsha in the Torah was already talking about korban chatas. However, just before this topic of the blood of a korban going into the heichal, it discussed having to wash out vessels that the korban was cooked in. And there, we already extended it to all korbanos. And therefore, if already contextually we were extending to all korbanos, so chatas the katas v'achmana lamali shmamina chatas imida achmina lo. Therefore, when the pasuk here, by bringing the blood of the korban into the heichal, says chatas, it must be limiting it to chatas. Rather, if you want to make a metaphor, it's to this. What it's really similar to is if you have a student who is diluting his Rebbe's wine for him with hot water, with cold water, with a variety of temperatures. And the Rebbe says, wait, al tim zogli ele b'chamen. I only want you to use hot water. Clearly, he's limiting it to only hot water. So rather, Ravuna Breder Yeshua pushes back and says, wait, yes, the Parsha B'Gedol is talking about korban chatas, but literally, right before it was talking about the korbanis whose blood is brought into the heichal, it was talking about washing out the vessels that the meat of the korban was cooked in. And that was applied not just to chatas, but to all korbanos. So already we broadened the context not just from chatas, but to be about all korbanos. So we're already talking about all korbanos. So if this halacha about bringing the blood of korbanos into the heichal was meant to be for all korbanos, like Rabbi Akiva says, well then it shouldn't have said chatas at all. It should have just, the context was already extended to all korbanos. It should have then just said, v'chol asher yuva midama, etc. And it would have been all korbanos, just like the previous halacha by the washing of the vessels was all korbanos. So when it says chatas, what it's saying is, we're not talking about all korbanos anymore. We're limiting it to only chatas. Yes, we were talking about all korbanos in the previous halacha, but now it's only chatas. So if Rav Huna Breder Yeshua makes the argument that says, no, one second, if it says chatas in this pasuk, it should be only chatas. So if that's the case, then how do you explain Rabbi Akiva? Why does Rabbi Akiva say it applies to all korbanos? So rather, says Rav Huna Breder Yeshua, that Rabbi Akiva extends this halacha to all korbanos, not just because it says chatas, because as Rav Huna Breder Yeshua argued, if just from chatas it would be limited to chatas, but because it says, right, the first words of the pasuk, v'chol chatas, it says v'chol. If it just said chatas, it would be limited to chatas, but it says v'chol chatas. At the time that we give him mechatas v'chol chatas. It didn't just say chatas; it says v'chol chatas. The time of learning the brayso, chatas ein le'ele chatas. That if it were to only have said chatas, it would be limited. The halacha of the blood going into the heichal, making the korban pasul, would be limited to chatas. Kodshe Kodshim minayin. How do we know even to include other Kodshe Kodshim, like an Ola, Osham? Talmud Omer Kol Chatos. It says all Kol Chatos. Kodshim Kalim minayin. How do we know to extend it even to Kodshim Kalim, like Shlomim, for example, Toda? Talmud Omer V'chol. It says V'chol Chatos. The extra vav. Therefore, it's talking about not just a korban chatas, not just Kodshe Kodshim, but also Kodshim Kalim. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. That is the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. I'm going to drink a little bit more water. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says to Rabbi Akiva, Afilu ata marbe kol hayom kulo eini shomeh lecho. Says Rabbi Yossi Aglili to Rabbi Akiva, you can include whatever you want all day long. I'm not going to hear of it. Ella, rather, chatos ein lechatos yochid. Now, when the pasuk says chatos, it means an individual chatos. The blood of an individual chatos that's brought into the heichal is pasul. Makes the korban pasul. Chatas tzibur minayin. How do we know to include this even with chatos at tzibur, communal guilt sin offerings? Tamlomar kol chatos ve'en li ela chatos zocher. All I know is male chatos is chatos nikev minayin. How do we know even to include female chatos is? Tamlomar vichol. It says vichol klapelaya. We say, one second, what does this mean? That by default it would include male chatases, and we have to especially include female chatases. Chevre, you know, friends, I was reflecting on this earlier, friends. Masechtas Zevachim has been really hard, you know. We're almost 3 months into Masechtas Zevachim. You know, we really started jumping into Kodshim when it came to Masechta Horius, which was 2 weeks before Zevachim. Masechta Horius was already very difficult. It was already Kodshim. So really for the past 3 months we've been learning Kodshim and it's been really, really hard. But Chevra, you know something? 3 months ago, if I would have said Korban Chatas, I'm talking to myself. I assume that it applies. I assume that maybe other people feel the same way. 3 months ago you say Korban Chatas, alright, it's a Korban. Chatas, Ola, Shlomim, okay, Korbanos. Now all of a sudden you say Korban Chatas, it's like, oh, Korban Chatas. Right. Kispa Vesira. It's female. And Rabbi Yossi Aglili is coming and saying, all I know is male Chatasis. I'm saying, male Chatasis? What a male? 3 months ago, okay, Chatas is a type of Korban. Male, female, goat, sheep, I don't know, cow, all of a sudden we see Chatas. We know Chatas, right? It's Kispa Vesira. Well, male Chatas, what do you mean male Chatas? By default, it's female. Kilo. Point I make is we've come a long way. We've been working really hard, but we've come a long way. We've peeled layers of the Torah that we're very lucky to have peeled. I think we should consider ourselves to be fortunate that we had the opportunity to peel, to work really hard and really challenge ourselves, but to peel back these very subtle layers of the Torah that, man, it's a real opportunity. It's a real zchus, it's a real privilege to have been able to have the opportunity to see these parts of the Torah. So Ela Achikama, rather, Eni Ela Chatas Nekeva Chatas Zocher Minayin. Rather the other way around. Okay, this makes more sense. Okay, all I know is by default a female chatas. How do I know even a male chatas? Because there could be examples of male chatases. So nu chevra, for example, Sa'ir Nasi. Who would have even heard about Sa'ir Nasi 3 months ago? Now it's like, oh, okay, yeah, male korban chatas. What's that? Sa'ir Nasi. What else? I don't know. Maybe Sirei Regalim. Unbelievable. We've worked really hard, but it's seeping in. So Tamloma V'chol Chatas, it says V'chol. Chatas V'chol is to include even male Korban Chatases. V'sover Yossi Aglili heichal also. No, fact, one second. Rabbi Yossi Aglili just gave a whole shtickle Torah on chatas, kol chatas, vichol chatas, individual korbanos, communal korbanos, male korbanos. But V'atanim, we're learning about it. So Rabbi Yossi Aglili Omer, Rabbi Yossi Aglili learns out something completely different from this very pasuk. That this pasuk about the blood being brought into the heichal, it's talking about parim anisrofim and seirim anisrofim, lisrof psulei and abeis abira. That if they become pasul, so then you burn them in the azarah. You don't bring them outside you don't bring them outside michutz lamachne to burn it there. Rather, you burn it bakodesh ba'esh tisar, if the pasuk says, v'lamad below saisa alichiloso, and that if you eat it, you're going to be, right, it says, lo sochelu, lo seochel, and if you eat it, you're going to be violating a mitzvah lo saisei. That's what Rabbi Yossi Aglili learns out from this pasuk. Not to be talking about different drushes about a korban chatas. So they said to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, chatas shenichnas dama lefnai v'lefnim minayin. So he says to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, well, if you learn that this pasuk is talking about par v'sara and aisa b'fnim, parim anisrofim, sirim nisrofim, to teach the lav if you eat it, and that if it becomes pasul, you burn it in the azarah. Well, if that's the case, then how do you know the simple halacha that if a korban chatos, its blood is brought into the regular korban chatos, its blood is brought into the heichal, even though it says lifnai v'lifnim, I believe here it doesn't actually mean the Kodesh HaKadoshim, it means the heichal. So they asked Rabbi Yossi Aglili, how do you know then the halacha that the blood of a korban chatos that's brought into the heichal, the korban is pasul? So he responds to them, of course, there's another pasuk, which I think, I don't remember if it's going to come up, but the pasuk says, with Moshe Rabbeinu and Aharon and his children, after Nadav and Avihu die, they had burnt a korban chatas, and Moshe Rabbeinu says, why did you burn the korban? What, was his blood brought into the azarah? Because if the blood was brought into azarah, to the heichal, if the blood of the chatas was brought into the heichal, so then the chatas would have been pasul, and I understand why you would have burnt it. So we see from that pasuk that blood of a korban chatas that's brought into the heichal, the korban becomes pasul. So Rabbi Yossi Aglili says, look, I learned it out from there. No, so why is Rabbi Yossi Aglili? So Rabbi Akiva had learned out from when it says chatos, it means the korban chatos. When it says kol chatos, it means even kachim kachim. When it says vichol chatos, it means even kachim kalim. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says, no, that's not how to learn the pasuk. The way to learn the pasuk is that chatos means chatos hayochid, kol chatos means chatos hatzibor, vichol chatos means even zachars. But we're saying, Rabbi Yossi Aglili doesn't learn that from the pasuk. He uses the pasuk talking about parim anisrofim and sirim anisrofim. So the Gemara says, you're right. Rabbi Yossi Aglili does learn from that pasuk, parim anisrofim and sirim anisrofim. However, when he said that you learn out individual chatases, communal chatases, and he was just responding to Rabbi Akiva, saying, look, Rabbi Akiva, if you're going to be learning these kinds of things out from the pasuk, to say that from chatas, we learn chatas, from kol, we learn kachim, vichol, kachim kalim. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says, look, if you're going to be darshaning the pasuk that way, that's not the right way to darshan it. The right way to darshan it in that case would be that chatas means chatas hayochid, kol chatas means chatas hatzibor, and vichol chatas means even if they are zcharim. So Rabbi Yossi Aglili says to Rabbi Akiva, look, if you're going to take that route, and that's how you're going to darshan the pasuk, then darshan it the way I'm saying. The fact of the matter is, though, that isn't how Rabbi Yossi Aglili himself learns the pasuk. The way that he learns it out himself is that it's talking about parim hanisrofim and sirim hanisrofim. Friends, and now we get up to the next section of today's daf, really the next Mishnah, and also the next section, which discusses when some blood exits the azarah. Let's see. So it says in the Mishnah, chatas shekibal dama b'shnei koses. So for example, if you have a korban chatas that its blood was received in 2 vessels, 2 cups. Yatsa echad mein lechutz. Now, if one of the cups makes its way outside of the azarah, and the other one remains in the azarah, pnimi kosher. So, of course, the one that left the azarah is pasul biyotze, but the one that is still in the azarah remains kosher. Now, what happens if one of the cups made its way into the heichal? Rabbi Yosef Glili machshir b'chitzon. So Rabbi Yosef Glili says, okay, well, the one that made its way into the heichal is pasul, but the cup that remains in the azarah remains kosher. The Chacham say pasul. The Chacham say that if one of the cups makes its way into the heichal, the one in the azarah is also pasul. Amr Rabbi Yosef Glili. Now Rabbi Yosef Glili says, and he makes a kal v'chomer. And we're going to have lots of kal v'chomers for the next chunk of Gemara. Ma'im b'makom shemachshava poseles b'chutz. Look, when it comes to pigol, when it comes to chutz lizmanu chutz limkomo, so if a person has machshavas chutz limkomo, that he's gonna, let's say, slaughters a korban with the intention of eating it outside of it's a korban chatas. He slaughters the korban chatas with the intention of eating it outside of the azarah. So when it comes to chutz limkomo, so chutz limkomo, machshavas chutz limkomo is pasul, which means that, so in that sense, bachutz is stringent, right? Machshavas chutz limkomo outside of the azarah is pasul. Lo asa es hamishuyur kayotze. And certainly, not certainly, and even so, even though yotze, even though bachutz is stringent in that a korban is pasul with machshavas chutz limkomo, and yet if one cup leaves the azarah and one cup remains in the azarah, the cup that remains in the azarah is kosher, i.e. we're lenient in that sense. So even when it comes to chutz, which is a more stringent scenario, because machshavas chutz lizmanu is pasul, and yet we're lenient in terms of the cup that remains in the azarah remains kosher. Well, then I would argue that makom she'ein amachshava poseles bifnim. Now, if a person slaughters a korban, as we've learned in the past, and as we'll learn again today, that if a person slaughters a korban with the intention of eating it in the heichal, that's not considered machshavas chutz limkomo. It's not pasul. So it's more, so pnim, the heichal, is more lenient in that sense. Well, then certainly I would argue, enodin shelo naase esa mishuyur kanichnos. So then certainly I would say that the cup of blood that remains in the heichal should be kosher. Okay, so the Chacham had said that when it comes to the two cups of chatas blood and one is brought into the heichal, so the Chacham say that the one that remains in azarah is pasul, but Rabbi Yosef Glili makes an argument to say that if by chutz, which is a more stringent scenario, because machshavas chutz limkomo is pasul, and yet we're saying that if one cup goes outside the azarah, the one that remains in the azarah is kosher. Certainly by going into the heichal, where it's more lenient in that machshavas, if a person slaughters a korban with the machshav of eating it in the heichal, the korban is kosher. So the heichal is more lenient in that sense. Certainly, I should say that if one cup goes into the heichal and the other one remains in the azarah, so the one that remains in the azarah should be kosher. Argues Rabbi Yosef Glili to the Chacham say it's pasul. Now, nichnas lechaper, if, let's say, the blood of a korban chatas was brought into the heichal with the intention of applying its blood to the mizbeach hapnimi. Avapisha lo kiper, pasul div Rabbi Eliezer. Says Rabbi Eliezer, if a person brought the blood of a korban chatas into the heichal, a chatas achitzon, the blood was brought into the heichal with the intention of applying the blood to the mizbeach hapnimi, even if it was not in the end applied to the mizbeach hapnimi, it is still pasul according to Rabbi Eliezer. Reb Shimon Omer says Reb Shimon, which is interesting. I feel it's not very often that Reb Shimon and Rabbi Eliezer would be. I imagine they weren't actually having a machlokas. I don't know that Reb Shimon overlapped with Rabbi Eliezer, but and that's, I guess, why it's interesting that it's not so often, I feel like, that they would be kind of have their opinions laid out like this in a Mishnah. Reb Shimon Omer says, Reb Shimon, Ad sheyichaper. Reb Shimon says that you would have to actually apply the blood to the Mizbeach HaPnimi in order for the korban to be pasul. Rabbi Yehuda Omer says, Rabbi Yehuda, im ichnis shogeg kosher. Rabbi Yehuda says that if a person accidentally brought the blood of a korban into the heichal, so then the korban chatas, let's say, accidentally brought the blood of a korban chatas into the heichal, the korban remains kosher, right? If it was an accident. Kol adamim psulin, all pasul blood, shenidnu al gabe hamizbeach, all pasul blood that was placed on the mizbeach. Lo hirtze atzitz, the tzitz is not going to fix it, not going to make it good, not going to appease. Ela ala tameh, only for tumah. Shatzitz meratza ala tameh, ve'enim meratza ala yotze. That when we say that the tzitz is meratza, that the fact that the Kohen Gadol has his golden tzitz on his forehead, the fact that it appeases for korbanos, it appeases for tumah sakodshim, for tumah, it does not appease for yotze. Right, if it's not going to fix the fact that blood went out of the azarah. Drink a stickle water. It says the Gemara. So now we're going to have a number of these kind of kal v'chomers like we had in the Mishnah. These like logical arguments. We're going to have a few of these. Tani, we learn in the Brisa, says the Gemara. Amar Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Says Rabbi Yossi Aglili, kal v'chomer. So when it comes to bachutz, right? So bachutz is outside of the azarah, bifnim is in the heichal. Okay, so when it comes to bachutz, where machshavas chutz limkomo is pasul, bachutz, so bachutz is more stringent. Lo pasul dam shebachutz es shebifnim, and yet when one of the cups is brought lachutz and one is left in the azarah, the one in the azarah remains kosher, even though bachutz is a stringent scenario. Machshevetz chutz limkomo is pasul after all, and yet we're lenient in that the cup that remains in the azarah remains kosher. So makom she'ein machshava posel is bifnim. So then, when it comes to pnim, to the heichal, where machshava, right, somebody slaughters a korban with the machshava eating it in the heichal, it remains kosher. So certainly, if one cup was brought into the heichal, I would say that the one that remains in the azarah should remain kosher. This is essentially the argument that we saw Rabbi Yossi Aglili make in the Mishnah. So why do the rabbis say that if one cup was brought into the heichal, the cup that remains in the azarah is pasul? Why do they say that? Because the pasuk says, "Harei Omer asher yuva mi dama afilu miktsas dama." That the pasuk that talks about the blood of a chatas being brought into the heichal and making the korban pasul says, "V'chol chatas asher yuva mi dama," from its blood, even if only some of its blood was brought in to the heichal, that would be enough to make the korban pasul, and that's why the blood that remains in the heichal, in the azarah, is going to be pasul according to the chacham. Omar loim. So now, Rabbi Yossi Aglili continues, and he says to the chachamim, Kal v'chomer layotze me'ata. But now then, I will make the following kal v'chomer. Uma b'makom she'ein machshava poselis bifnim, and yet posel dam shebifnim es shebachutz. Well, now I'll make the argument then that, well, if when it comes to bifnim, into the heichal, where it is more lenient in that if you slaughter a korban with machshav of eating it in the heichal, it's still kosher, so it's more lenient. And yet, if one cup, according to you, chachamim, was brought into the heichal, the one that remains in the azarah is pasul. Well, then certainly I would argue that if one cup leaves the azarah, outside of the azarah, and outside bachutz is more stringent in that machshavas chutz limkomo is pasul. Certainly, if one cup goes outside, the one that remains in the azarah should be pasul. So makom shemachshava posel is bachutz. Certainly, then when it comes to bachutz, where a machshavas chutz l'mkomo is pasul, eino din, certainly sheyifsal dam shebachutz es shebifnim. If one cup leaves the azarah to go outside the azarah, the one that remains in the azarah should be pasul, because bachutz is more stringent. Amrullah, they said to him, Hareyu Omer, Asher Yuva, Anichnas pasul v'nayosei pasul. Yes, but the pasuk, when it talks about the blood going into the heichal, it says Asher Yuva. Blood that is brought in to the heichal. It's not talking about blood that leaves the azarah to go outside of the azarah. And therefore, if one cup leaves the azarah and one remains in the azarah, the one that remains in the azarah will remain kosher. V'ha v'tehei machshava bifnim poseles mikav v'chomer. Okay, but let's make the kav v'chomer to make the argument that if one slaughters a korban with the intention of eating it in the heichal, it should be pasul, not kosher. Mikav v'chomer u'ma b'makom shelo pasal dam shebachutz es shebifnim. Because if, when it comes to blood that leaves the azarah, and it will be pasul, but the blood that remains in the azarah is going to be kosher, and yet when you have machshava, when you slaughter an animal with the machshava of eating it outside of the azarah, it's pasul. Shelo pasal dam shebachutz es shebifnim machshava paseles bachutz. Makom shepasal dam shebifnim es dam shebachutz. Well then, certainly then, based on what the rabbis say, that blood that's brought into the heichal makes the blood in the azarah pasul. Enu din shitei machshava paseles bifnim. Well then, certainly, if I slaughter a korban with the intention of eating it in the heichal, certainly it should make the korban pasul. Harei omer bayom hashlishi. We've learned this before, that the pasuk says in the context of pigul bayom hashlishi that when it comes to chutz l'mkomo, it's makom sheyeh mishulash b'dam b'basar v'emurim. Then when we're talking about chutz l'mkomo, we're talking about a place that has three characteristics. A place that is shaykh to blood, meat, and emurim, outside of the azarah. For example, in time periods in our history when bamas were permitted to be constructed and korbanos could be offered on bamas, so on bamas, which are outside of the azarah, you would be applying blood, you would be burning meat, you would be burning emurim, if it's a korban shlamim. However, in the heichal, blood is applied in the heichal sometimes, but there's no meat being burnt in the heichal, there's no emurim being burnt in the heichal, and therefore the heichal would not have this, check off this box of being ashlishi, having this trifecta of characteristics, and therefore having machshava to eat the korban in the heichal is not going to make the korban possible. But having machshava to eat the korban outside of the azarah, that will make the korban pasul. Velote machshava poseles bachutz mikav v'chomer. Okay, well now let's suggest that maybe slaughtering a korban with the intention of eating it outside of the azarah should be kosher from a kav v'chomer. Uma makom shepasal dam shebifnim es shebachutz. Well, if when it comes to bifnim, which is more stringent in that if blood is taken into the heichal, the blood that remains in the azarah is pasul, and yet ein machshava poseles bifnim, and yet slaughtering a korban with the intention of eating it in the heichal, it's still a kosher korban. Well, makom shelo pasul dam shebachutz es shebifnim. Well, when it comes to bachutz, which is more lenient in that if one cup is taken outside of the azarah, the cup that remains in the azarah remains kosher. So bachutz is more lenient in that way. And udin shelo yeh posel machshava bachutz. Well, then certainly I should argue that slaughtering a korban with the intention of eating it outside of azarah, we should be lenient there as well and say that it is kosher. Tamloma shlishi chutz lizmano pigul chutz limkomo. Yeah, but we have a pasuk that when the pasuk says shlishi, it's talking about chutz lizmano. When it says pigul, the pasuk is talking about chutz limkomo, i.e., when there's a machshava to eat the korban outside of the azarah. If we're talking about a korban chatas, right, kachim. So we have a pasuk saying that bachutz is going to be pasul. So bachutz is going to be pasul. Okay. shtickle more water. Now says the Gemara, Basar ayotze lachutz pasul, hanichnas lefnim kosher. Says the Gemara, we've been talking about blood that leaves the azarah, blood that goes into the heichal. What about the meat of a korban? So it says the Gemara, basar, when it comes to the meat of a korban, ayotze lachutz pasul, the meat of a korban that goes outside of the azarah is pasul. If we're talking about a korban chatas, let's say, hanichnas lifnim kosher. Now, meat that is brought into the heichal is kosher. Sheyeh badin, because I could have made the argument, shapasul, I could have made the argument that meat brought into the heichal should be pasul, because huma b'makom shelo pasul dam shebachutz as shebifnim. Well, because when it comes to bachutz, which is more lenient, in that when we have blood and one cup of blood is brought outside of the azarah, the one that remains in the azarah remains kosher. Basar ayotze lachutz pasul, and yet when meat leaves the azarah, it's pasul. So even though we're lenient when it comes to bachutz, in terms of if one cup of blood leaves the azarah and one remains, the one that remains is kosher, and yet we're stringent in that if meat leaves the azarah, it's pasul. So I would have made the argument that according to Chachamim, who say that if one cup of blood is brought into the heichal, the one that remains in the azarah is pasul, so it's more stringent in that sense. I would say, I would say then certainly if we're more stringent when it comes to the heichal, if meat is brought into the heichal, of course it should be pasul. Hari Omer midama dama v'lo basar. So he said yes, but the pasuk says that Revachol chatas u'shayuva midama el moed. Right, any chatas whose blood is brought into moed, it's the blood that makes it pasul, not when it goes into the heichal, not the meat. Kal v'chomer, you can add the two words livasar ayotze me'ata. Okay, but now let's reverse the kal v'chomer and say, Uma b'makom shepasal dam shebifnim shebachutz basar nichnas lefnim kosher. Well, I'll say that, if when it comes to the heichal, where it's more stringent in that when one cup of blood is brought into the heichal, the blood that remains in the azarah is pasul, and yet when meat goes into the heichal, it's kosher. So makom shelo pasal dam shebachutz as shebifnim. Well, when it comes to outside of the azarah, where it's more lenient, in that if one cup of blood leaves the azarah, it's pasul, but the blood in the azarah remains kosher. Well, in basar ayotze lachutz enudin shekosher, then certainly I should say that meat that leaves the azarah should also be kosher. So Omer uvasar basade treifa lo sochelu. Yes, but the pasuk says, right, could have just said basar treifa lo sochelu. Don't eat treif meat, but it says basade treifa lo sochelu. What's basade? So kevin sheyotza basar chutz lemchitzaso neser. What it's teaching is basada. Basada is an open place without walls. So what it's teaching is that once meat leaves the azarah and it's outside of the walls of the Beis Hamikdash of the azarah, so then it is going to be pasul. Taner Abanon Pnima. So when the pasuk says Pnima, that's talking about the Kodesh HaKodashim. That if the blood is brought into the Kodesh HaKodashim, it's pasul. In the Pnima, all I know is the Kodesh HaKodashim, heichal minolin. How do I know that also if blood is brought into the heichal? So Tamalomar Ela Kodesh Pnima. It says Ela Kodesh Pnima. Kodesh is the heichal. So it says in the pasuk Kodesh, which is the heichal, and Pnima, which is the Kodesh HaKodashim. V'yomar Kodesh v'atomar Pnima. Let it just say Kodesh, which is the heichal, and I don't need to write the Kodesh HaKodashim. Kilu, if already once the blood is brought into the heichal, it's already pasul. Well, to get into the Kodesh HaKodashim, you're going to have to go through the heichal. So there's really no point of writing blood going into the Kodesh HaKodashim is going to be pasul, because it's already going to be pasul by the time it goes into the heichal already. So Omar, it says Rave, there's a different gears that says Rabba. I'm going to go with that. Omar Rabba, Bazev Limit Alzeh. well, you're coming and asking about why does it need to say Kodesh and Pnima? Can't you just say Kodesh and no Pnima? You're coming from retrospect once we've already told you that Kodesh is the heichal and Pnima is the Kodesh HaKodashim. But we only know that because we have both words. What does that mean? Mididahava atosha v'socher. Well, to illustrate this, let us look at toshav and socher. This is talking about truma. A kohen, of course, is allowed to eat truma. But what if a kohen has a doorman? Who wants to explain to everybody what a doorman is? A doorman, so there's a concept of an Eved Ivri. An Eved Ivri is a Yid who, for whatever reason, ends up being an Eved, ends up being a slave. So he's an Eved for 6 years. And then after 6 years, he goes home, he goes free. Now, if at the end of 6 years, he decides that he likes being as an Eved, Ahavtis Adonai, es ishti ves bonai, lo etzei chofshi, says, I want to stay. So what we do is, we take him to the doorpost, and we nail him to the doorpost by his ear, and he becomes a doorman until Yovel. Now, so the question is, if a kohen's allowed to eat truma, what about his doorman? When I say doorman, I mean an Eved who signs up to be an Eved until Yovel. I'm going to call him a doorman just for anybody who's not familiar with the shtick. Can a kohen's doorman eat truma? What about a kohen's? What about a regular Eved Ivri who's just there for 6 years and then he's going to go home? Can he eat truma? I believe an Eved Kanani can eat truma, and his wife and children can eat truma. Right, so the Tani we learned about is a toshav zekonu kinin olam. That when the pasuk, so what does the pasuk say? The pasuk says, I'm going to read the pasuk. V'chozar lo yochal kodesh. Any non-kohen cannot eat truma. Now toshav kohen v'sachir lo yochal kodesh. A toshav of a kohen and a sachir of a kohen cannot eat truma either. So toshav zekonu kinin olam. When the pasuk says toshav, it means the doorman. Sachir is zakonikin and shanim, and Sachir is a regular Eved Ivri. Yomar Toshav al Yomar Sachir. So let the pasuk just say doorman. The pasuk doesn't need to say anything about a regular Eved Ivri. Vani Omer, because I will make the following kavachomer konikin an olam eino ochel. If a doorman who's an Eved of the Kohen, not just for 6 years, but all the way until Yovel. And even so, if the pasuk says he cannot eat truma, so Konikin and Shanim lo kol sheken, certainly a regular Eved Ivri who's just doing a short stint for 6 years, certainly he would be unable to eat truma, right? If the Konikin olam cannot eat truma, certainly then the Kinyan Shanim, just the 6-year Eved, would be unable to eat truma. So why does the pasuk need to say Toshav and Sachir? Just say Toshav, and Toshav is a doorman, and if the doorman cannot eat truma, certainly the regular Eved Ivri cannot eat truma. So Ilu Kain, here's the thing. So the Brisa says, here's the thing. We need to write Toshav and Sachir because if it only said Toshav, Haisi Omer Toshav ze konoi kinyan shanim. Avo konoi kinyan olam yehei ochel. Here's the thing. We don't actually know what Toshav means. How do you know that Toshav means? How do you know that Toshav means a doorman? if the pasuk only said toshav, I might think it means a regular Eved Ivri. And the pasuk, if it only said toshav, meaning we want to say, in retrospect, we're saying, look, toshav is a doorman, Sachir is a regular Eved Ivri, and now we're saying, oh, okay, well, if Toshav is a doorman and Sachir is a regular Eved Ivri, why do I need both? Just tell me the doorman, and then certainly the regular Eved Ivri won't be able to eat Truma if the doorman can't. But yeah, you're coming with us with that analysis once you already know that Toshav is a doorman and Sachir is a regular Eved Ivri. But if it would only say Toshav, and we're trying to figure out what is this Toshav, I might think, that's a regular Eved Ivri, but a doorman can eat Truma. So therefore, the pasuk needed to say both Toshav and Sachir to make it clear that we're talking about both the doorman and the regular Eved Ivri, that neither of them can eat Truma. If it would have said one of them, then it may have thought that the one that it's talking about is the regular Eved Ivri. Therefore, you need to have Toshav and Sachir to say we're talking about not just regular Eved Ivri, but even the doorman cannot eat Truma. So we kind of need both of them, right? The existence of Sachir kind of highlights or elucidates, kind of teaches us about what Toshav is. So we need Sachir in order to understand what Toshav is. So Basachir v'limed al Toshav shezeh koni kinin olam v'zeh koni kinin shanim ve'eno ochel. So therefore we need, right? So therefore we have Toshav and Sachir, okay, to know that it's talking about both. I hope I didn't skip anything. Okay. Abaye says to Rabbah, he says, I don't know about the comparison between the two. Look, when it comes to Sachir and Toshav, I can understand why we needed to write both of them. Because I'll tell you something. You know what? Even if the pasuk would have said specifically Nirtza, even if, the whole svara that we just gave for the Toshav and the Sachir as well, Toshav and Sachir are vague. If it only said Toshav, I would mistakenly say it's talking about regular Eved Ivri. But says Abai, the truth of the matter is, even if it only said Nirtza, meaning if it was clear that it's talking about the doorman, I could still understand why it said the regular Eved Ivri as well. Because it's something that we could have learned out on logically, right? Use our noggins to say, well, even if the pasuk explicitly said a doorman can't eat truma, and I could say, well, if a doorman can't eat truma, so then certainly a regular Eved Ivri cannot eat truma. But the Torah said it anyways. Something that we could theoretically learn through kavachomer. The pasuk wrote it for us nonetheless. However, when it comes to Bakodesh Pnima, when it comes to the heichal and the Kodesh HaKadoshim, I really don't need it to say Kodesh HaKadoshim at all. Because since to get to the Kodesh HaKadoshim, I have to go through the heichal, so it's essentially irrelevant to say that I can't bring the blood, that any blood brought into the Kodesh HaKadoshim is going to be pasul. It's already going to be pasul by the time it goes into the heichal, so it's a non-starter. There's no chiddush, there's no reason to tell me that I can't take that if the blood goes into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, it's going to be pasul. I mean, it's a waste of ink. Of course it's pasul. It's already going to be pasul from the time it goes into the heichal. So Amalei Abai says to Rabbah, Bishlam Hasam, I understand over there by Toshav and Sachir, by Truma, Tregufa Ninu. They're two separate concepts, they're two separate people, a doorman, an Eved Ivri. I'm going to read now based on what the Shita Mikubesis writes. So the words I'm going to read are a little bit different from what the Gemara says for the next two lines or so. Dinami Kasav Rachmana Nirtza, even if the pasuk would have explicitly said a doorman cannot eat truma, lo yochal doesn't eat truma, havale sachir milsadasa b'kav chomer. Nonetheless, I could still understand why a regular Eved Ivri was written, because even though we could have learned it out through a kav chomer, certainly if the doorman can't eat truma, certainly a regular Eved Ivri cannot eat truma, but nonetheless. I'm back in the Gemara now. That even though you could have learned out that a regular Eved Ivri cannot eat truma from a kav chomer, said if a doorman can't eat it, certainly the regular Eved Ivri can't eat it. But nonetheless, there's a concept of milsa dasa b'kav chomer tarak v'chasav lakra. Even something that could have been learned from a kav chomer, the Torah nonetheless wrote it for us. But over here, to tell me that I need the Torah to write heichal in order for me to understand that pnima means the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Keva de ifsil beheichal lifnai v'lifnim my boy. Once the Torah already says that blood that goes into the heichal is pasul, there's really no point bichlal of writing that blood that goes into the Kodesh HaKadoshim is pasul. It's already pasul from the time that it came to the heichal. Drink a little water. And la'anamar Abai rather says Abai lo nitzucha ela the derech meshupish. Says Abai, you know why it needed to say the Kodesh HaKadoshim? Well, because what if you're not going to go through the heichal to get into the Kodesh HaKadoshim? What if you go through the roof or something? So it won't be pasul by going to the heichal. So kilu, because you can't assume that in every scenario the blood will be pasul already by the time it gets to the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So if the Torah says, even if you came to the roof or whatever into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the korban will be pasul if the blood gets into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Rava says to Abaye, hava oksiv, but the pasuk says v'chol dam asher, what is it? V'chol chatas asher yuva midama, that will be brought in, implying brought in regularly through the doors. Hello, my Rava rather says Rava komidi dechashiv ole lifnai b'neflim lo. Says Rava, well, here's the thing. I'll tell you why the pasuk got to say that if the blood is brought into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, it's pasul, even though I understand that it has to go through the heichal. The thing is, if he had intention to specifically be bringing the blood into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, it will only be pasul when it gets into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, not into the heichal. Kilu, if the intention was to bring the blood into the heichal, so it's pasul when it gets into the heichal. But if the intention was to bring it into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, it will only be pasul when it gets into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. It will not yet be pasul when it gets into the heichal, and therefore, that's why the pasuk has to say that the blood that goes into the Kodesh HaKadoshim is pasul. I.e., if the intention was to be brought into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, it's pasul when it gets into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, not when it gets in to the heichal. By Rava asks, Parilim davar shel tzibur, v'sari avodas kochavim. So when it comes to parilim davar shel tzibur, sari avodas zara, these are chatos apnimios, that the blood is applied in the heichal. Shehichnis dam lifnai v'liflim. But the kohen brought the blood not just into the heichal, but into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Mau, what's the halacha? Right? So the blood of these are chatos apnimios. So the blood is supposed to go into the heichal, but they brought it into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So would that make the korban pasul? Right? A chatos achitzon that is not supposed to go into the heichal. If its blood goes into the heichal, the chatos achitzon becomes pasul. Now in these cases, the chatos apnimios, the blood is already supposed to go into the heichal. So would bringing the blood into the Kodesh HaKadoshim be the equivalent, right, for chatos apnimios, be the equivalent of bringing the blood into the heichal for chatos achitzonios? I.e., would bringing the blood into the Kodesh HaKadoshim make these chatos apnimios pasul? Me'amina, do we say el hakodesh pnima? Kolecha de korinan el hakodesh korina le pnima? That only in scenarios where we would say that by the blood going into the heichal, it would be pasul. Would we say that bringing it to the Kodesh HaKadoshim it's pasul? I.e., chatos achitzonios. that if the blood is brought into the heichal, it's pasul. So also if the blood is brought into the Chodesh Kodashim, it's pasul. However, these korbanos are already, they're supposed to be brought into the heichal, so they won't be pasul by going into the Kodesh Kodashim. Kolecha de lo karinan ela kodesh lo karinan pnima, and by chatosa pnimios, where going to the heichal is what you're supposed to do, so it won't be possible by going to the kodesh kodashim. Or dilma, or perhaps shalobim koman who, or do we say, look, it's not supposed to be brought into the kodesh kodashim, we're being brought into the kodesh kodashim, we'll make it possible. Vimtim tzalomar shalobim koman who, and if you're going to say, yeah, it's going to be possible because the blood is not supposed to be going into the kodesh kodashim. Let me ask you the following question. Par v'sor Yom Kippurim. What about a par v'sor of Yom Kippurim that do go into the Kodesh HaKodashim? Shehiza midaman al abadim. So what happens on Yom Kippur, the par v'sor of Yom Kippurim, that were already brought into the Kodesh HaKodashim, and the blood was already sprinkled in the Kodesh HaKodashim, v'otzion leichol, and it was brought back out to the heichal after the avodah in the Kodesh HaKodashim was done, but then v'chnisan, and then they were brought back into the Kodesh HaKodashim after they were already brought out to the heichal. At this point, is it Mao? Do we say, well, look, I mean, yeah, the avodah was already done in the Kodesh HaKodashim, but the avodah of these korbanos is shaykh to the Kodesh HaKodashim, so therefore it will not be pasul. Or do we say, no, since the avodah in the Kodesh HaKodashim is already done, there's no business going back in there, and if you go back in there, it'll be pasul. And if you're going to say, since they have no business going back into the Kodesh HaKodashim, it's pasul. Okay, what about if with on Yom Kippur, the Kohen goes out of the Kodesh HaKodashim back into the heichal, and he now sprinkles the blood towards the kapores, and he's done with that now, and now he goes to apply the blood to the Mizbeach HaPnimi, the Mizbeach, and they're taken out to the Mizbeach HaPnimi. It's, the pasuk refers to it as being taken out, right? It says, the Yotza el Mizbeach Asher Lifnei Hashem, they'll go out to the Mizbeach before Hashem, even though he's already in the heichal, right? Because he left the Kodesh HaKodashim, went into the heichal, sprinkled the blood towards the parochas in the heichal, and now he's just moving further back to the Mizbeach HaPnimi, that's towards the entrance of the heichal. But the pasuk uses the word v'hotzi. So now v'chnisan, if after he brought the blood back to the Mizbeach HaPnimi, he brought it then back to the parochas. So still in the heichal, but the pasuk says, use the word hotzah as if it's going into a different place. So ma'u vadai chad makamu. Okay, it's all in the heichal. Odilma yitzia karina bay. But we refer to it as Yitziyah, so maybe it's more significant. Teiko, we say, let's go weiter. Alright, friends, we are now in Daf Pei Gimel Amud Aleph. If you are kind of exhausted, I get you. You can, I guess, pause it and then come back to it tomorrow. We're already on the next Daf, but I want to just kind of push and go to the end over here. So we now get up to the final section of the Daf, at which point blood becomes pasul in the heichal. We saw a machlokas already in the Mishnah that Rabbi Eliezer says that once the blood is brought into the heichal, if you have a blood of achatas, it's brought into the heichal, it automatically becomes pasul. Reb Shimon had said it only becomes pasul if you actually apply the blood to the Mizbeach HaPnimi. Now we're going to learn about the nature of this machlokas. So nichnas L'chaper Tanya or B'lezer or sister of B'lezer Nemar Kan l'chaper b'kodesh. It says in our pasuk, right? It says v'chochatas sher yuva midama el oil moed l'chaper b'kodesh. V'nemar lahalon, and it says in the context of Yom Kippur, v'chol adam lo yiyeh b'oil moed b'vo l'chaper b'kodesh, that nobody should be in the oil moed when the Kohen Gadol goes in l'chaper b'kodesh. Now it says that nobody should be in the oil moed b'vo, when he goes into the oil moed, even before he's actually done the avodah in the oil moed. Even just when he goes in, nobody, right, there's a warning that nobody should be in there. So malal b'shalo kiper, so just like when it says l'chaper b'kodesh in that context, the Kohen Gadol hasn't actually done any avodah yet. So af kan b'shalo kiper, here as well, if the blood of the chatas is brought into the heichal, even if it wasn't actually applied to the mizbeach hapnimi, it's already, the korban is already pasul. Reb Shimon says, Reb Shimon nemar kan l'chaber. Reb Shimon says, look, it says in our case l'chaper, by the blood, but v'nemar l'alin, it also says by Yom Kippur a different pasuk, and that pasuk by Yom Kippur says ves para chatos ves soira chatos asher huva es domam l'chaper, that their blood was brought l'chaper. So malaholan kishakiper avkam kishakiper, right? It says the pasuk that we're talking about now. I'll read the pasuk. It says vespaya chatos vesara chatos. Okay, and Yom Kippur asher huva es dom l'chaper b'kodesh, that their blood was already brought in l'chaper b'kodesh. Yotzia mechutz hamachne v'sarfu pa'eshes orosim v'sbasar mispirsham. It's saying that these korbanos, that all the avodah has already been done with them. What do you do with them? The par and sar of Yom Kippur, you bring them outside of the machane, and you burn them there. So we're talking about after the avodah has already been done. So malahalim b'shakiper avkam b'shakiper. So just like in that pasuk, we're talking about where the avodah has already been done. So here also we're talking about where the blood was brought into the heichal and was actually applied to the mizbeach hapnimi. But Micah Miflige, what's the nature of the machlokas? Why does Rabbi Eliezer choose to learn it out from the pasuk when the avodah has not yet been done, and Rabbi Shimon learns out from the pasuk where the avodah has been done? Masara done chutz mi chutz ve'dan chutz mi bifnim. Because Rabbi Eliezer says, look, we learn chutz from chutz, right? By the pasuk that we've been talking about, which is the korban chatas, that his blood is brought into the eichel. Korban chatas is a chatas achitzon, an outer korban chatas, and also by the warning on Yom Kippur when it says v'chol adam lo yeh ba'al moed. These are people that are standing outside of the azarah. The people standing outside of the azarah shall not go into the azarah when the Kohen Gadol goes into the azarah. So therefore, he says, learn it out from there, rather than the pasuk that Reb Shimon learns it out from, which is talking about the chatos hapnimios. We're not going to learn chatos achitzon from chatos hapnimios. Whereas Rabbi Shimon says, yes, but the chatos achitzon and the chatos hapnimios are at the end of the day animals. They're both animals. Whereas the v'chol adam lo yeh ba'ol moed, that's talking about people. Says Reb Shimon, we're going to learn an halacha about an animal from another animal rather than from people. Rabbi Yehuda had said that if the blood was accidentally brought into the heichal, so then the korban is kosher. Hamezid pasul, okay, sure, fine. Rabbi Yehuda says if accidentally the blood was brought into the eichel, the korban is kosher, implying that if intentionally the blood was brought into the eichel, it's pasul. B'shakiper or b'shalo keeper. Now, what's his position? Does he hold like Rabbi Eliezer that it would automatically be pasul if the blood was intentionally brought into the heichal, or does he hold like Reb Shimon that it would only be pasul once it was actually applied to the mizbeach hapnimi? Amar Reb Yirmiyah, says Reb Yirmiyah, you could add the two words Tashma D'Tanya that we learn in the Brisa. Mimash Moshe Nemar Vespara Chatos Vesara Chatos Asher Huva Es Damam L'Chaper B'Kodesh. That when the pasuk says that we read, this was the pasuk that Reb Shimon learned from, that the Parachatas and the Sarachatas and Yom Kippur, that their blood was already, the avodah was already done. Matam Lomer Vasoref. Then the next pasuk talks about I'm going to read you the next pasuk. Says Vasoref also michabes begadav rachas es b'sar b'amayim, etc. And whoever then goes, right, because the previous pasuk says that the par v'sar of Yom Kippur, that the avodah has already been done, you take it outside mechutz hamachne and you burn it there. And then the next pasuk says, and the one who burns it, he becomes tummy and his clothing becomes tummy, he has to go to the mikvah. Matam lomer vasoref. Why does it have to say the next pasuk about the person who burning it becomes tameh? Matam lomer vasoref legufe itztrich. What do you mean? Why does it have to say that the person who burns it, his clothing is tameh? How else would we know that the person who burns it, his clothing is tameh? Of course, we need that pasuk. No, rather, when it says it's para chatos, vesara chatos, why does it say chatos twice? The reason is because all we know is in the context of Yom Kippur. For the par v'sar of Yom Kippur, I'm going to read the words a little bit differently here. That the one who burns these animals after the avodah has been done, their clothing becomes tamei, and that the korbanos are burnt outside of the camps. How do I know that this isn't just by the Par V'Sar of Yom Kippur, but all of the Chatos of Pinimios? Par Lim Davar Shel Tzibur, Par Kohen Mashiach, Seir Avodas Kuchavim. So Talmud Omer Chatos is the very beautiful because it says Chatos twice. It says an extra Chatos to say that these halachas of becoming Tamei, of having to burn the animal, Michutz Lamachne, these apply not just to Par V'Sar of Yom Kippur, but rather to all of the chatos of Penimios. Drink a little water. Now says Reb Meir Omer, Eino tzarich. No, you don't need to learn it from chatos from the extra chatos. Rather, Hareyu Omer, the pasuk says Vespara chatos, Vesara chatos, Shein Talmud Omer l'chaper. Right? If we look at the pasuk, it says Vespara chatos, Vesara chatos. Right on Yom Kippur. And then it says, Asher huva es domam l'chaper b'kodesh, that their blood was brought and it was mechaper, but why is that relevant? Just say, Vespara chatas, Vesara chatas, Yotze mechutz l'macha. Why is it important to say, Asher huva es domam l'chaper b'kodesh? Right? L'chaper matam l'omer. Why does it say that? You can add the word bifnim. What it's saying is that to say, the reason why it says is because Asher Huva is Domam, it's saying that all of the Chatos are Pnimios, Asher Huva is Domam. They are Matame Begadim. So I don't need to learn out from Chatas, I need to learn out from the extra Asher Huva is Domam. The Chaper Bakodesh. And why doesn't Rabbi Yehuda learn it out from there? Not because he needs Gzeir Shavah, meaning Rabbi Yehuda learns out the halacha that the one who burns it is going to become tamei from the chatas, the extra chatas. Why doesn't he agree with Rabbi Meir and say to learn it out from the Asher Huva es Domam l'chaper b'kodesh? I'll tell you why. Because that's unavailable for Rabbi Yehuda to learn that out. Because Rabbi Yehuda already learns out something else from there. I.e., Reb Shimon's Gezer Shava of that it says l'chaper by blood going into the heichal, and it says l'chaper by the korbanos of Yom Kippur, that the avodah has already been done with them, to say that for bringing the blood into the heichal, you're only going to be chayiv if you've actually already done you applied it to the Mizbeach HaPnimi. And therefore, that is why Rabbi Yehuda had to learn out from Chatas, because from Lechaper, he learns out, like Reb Shimon, that it's only pasul once the blood has been applied to the Mizbeach HaPnimi. Hadron Olach kol azvachim she nisarvu. Woo! Sheesh. Cheveh, that was Daf Pei Beis of Masechta Zvachim. It was a big daf, which is, we started on Daf Pei Aleph, and we finished on Daf Pei Gimel. There were three main sections of Daf Pei Beis. There was when blood gets into the heichal. We saw the machlokas between Reb Akiva, the Chachamim, and Reb Eliezer. Reb Akiva says that all korbanos that their blood is brought into the heichal are the korban becomes pasul. The Chachamim say it's only by chatas, and Reb Eliezer says chatas and asham. When some blood exits the azarah, this was the Mishnah. We got to a new Mishnah that had said that if you have the korban chatas and the blood is received in two vessels, if one of the vessels exits the azarah, so if we're talking about going outside of the azarah, so then the blood that remains in the azarah is kosher. If we're talking about the blood, one of the cups going into the heichal, well then the Chacham say that the blood in the azarah is pasul. Rabbi Yosef Glili says that the blood in the azarah remains kosher. And finally, at which point blood becomes pasul in the heichal? Rabbi Eliezer says immediately upon entering, right? If you bring blood into the heichal, it becomes pasul immediately upon entering. Rabbi Shimon says only once it's applied to the inner altar. And Rabbi Yehuda says that if the blood was accidentally brought into the heichal, so then it remains kosher. Friends, that was the pei beis of Masechta Zevachim. Hope you enjoyed. Cheers.